Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Emma Everard, and today I will present the results of our project on behalf of my colleagues as well. And our project focuses on the language development of children with 22q. So I would like to start off by, we discussed it already yesterday a bit, but the difference between speech and language, because although they are related, they're not the same thing. So speech really refers to the sounds you can make using your mouth, your tongue, your vocal cords, and maybe your palate. And it is a way to express language, but it's not the only way to express language. And you can also make speech sounds that are not language. Language, on the other hand, refers to sort of the system and the rules that we have in which we can combine these sounds into words and these words into sentences. So there are rules on which sounds make a word and which words can make a grammatically correct sentence and a sentence that carries meaning. So that's really about grammar and vocabulary. And language is also both about production and comprehension. So language production is really about the language that you produce yourself, which can be spoken using speech, but it can also be written or a sign language. And language comprehension is really about what you understand of the language that others produce. That can also be written language, so a reading, but also what others are saying to you. But that's a passive sort of action. So it's really about understanding. And as we know, a lot of children with 22q have speech problems, but language problems are also common. And today I will be mainly focusing on language, but also talking a little bit about speech. So what we currently know about language development in 22q is that language impairment is a common feature. And we mostly know this from previous studies in children of school age, so between the ages of 6 to 14 on average. And in this age, we see that children typically have more difficulties with language comprehension than with language production. So that means that understanding complex instructions are more difficult for them than producing language themselves, although both can be difficult. Because, for instance, we also see that they have difficulty making long sentences or telling coherent stories. In an earlier phase of childhood, we know that language typically emerges late, so a lot of children are late with starting to talk. But we don't quite know the details about what problems are present at this age. And neither do we know whether these problems persist into adulthood. So we don't know if these problems with language stay on or whether they resolve at some point. And those are really the areas that our project tries to look at. So these phases in childhood, early childhood and late adolescence, where we would like to know more about the language problems children might have. And today I'll be focusing on the early childhood part of the project. So the question and aims for this project are, what is the language profile of young children with 22q, specifically regarding language comprehension versus language production, but also whether these language problems are related to speech problems. Because as you can imagine, if you have difficulty producing speech, as a lot of young children with 22q do, it might also affect how you develop language. But is that the case? We don't quite know. So that's what we looked at. So there were 44 children in our study that participated, 25 boys and 19 girls, who were on average 4.9 years old, and they were all between the ages of 3 to 6.5. And their average IQ is 80, with a range, quite a broad range, from 50 to 103, which is actually quite in line with what we would expect at this age. And to give you an idea of the tasks that we did, because I can imagine that it's not... a lot of you have never seen language tasks. Some examples. So for language comprehension, we did tasks similar to this one, where children, for instance, see pictures and the experimenter says a sentence and the child has to point to the picture that matches the sentence. So they don't have to say anything themselves. They just have to point in response to what is being said to them. Whereas language production tasks require children to, for instance, name what they see on a picture, or to finish a sentence that is said by the experimenter, to show that they can, for instance, make a plural or conjugate a verb. And we also looked at speech problems, and these were rated by two expert speech and language therapists from the hospital who regularly work with children with 22q based on audio recordings in which the children were just spontaneously speaking, so freely playing with an experiment or with some toys. So it's not speech that is sort of produced in these more task settings. So regarding the first aim of the project, so the language profile, here you see a figure with the scores for the language production of not all children. Some children were not able to complete all tasks and therefore don't have a score. So it is important to note that this is a subset of the children, especially the younger children were not able to complete some of the tasks. Every blue dot is an individual child, and the dotted lines you see on top and in the middle indicate the range at which a score is considered age adequate. So children who are between these lines have language abilities that are in line with their chronological age. Children who are below the lowest dotted line have language skills that are below what would be expected for their age. As you can see, for language production, this is the majority of children with 22q. Now, adding comprehension, these are again the same children, so every child is on the left and on the right. You see that still the majority of children are below the lowest dotted line, but on average, the dots are a bit higher. So it shows that the language comprehension problems are not as severe as the language production problems at this age. And it's also important to note that these two sort of skills are highly correlated. So children who do well on production also do well on language comprehension and the other way around. So regarding the first question, we see that the language skills of young children with 22q are generally below what would be expected for their age. And we see that in contrast with what has been observed in older children, problems with language production are more prominent at this age than the problems with language comprehension. So it seems to be a different profile than later on in childhood. Now, looking at the secondary question, is it the case that all children with speech problems have language problems? Here I have a figure where you see vertically the amount of language problems, with on top no language problems and at the bottom severe language problems. And on horizontally, you see the severity of speech problems. On the left, very severe speech problems, and on the right, no speech problems. Again, every blue dot is an individual child. And here you see that in this orange box, there are children who have both severe speech problems, but also language problems. In this light blue box, there are children who have no speech problems and also no language problems. In this dark blue box would be children who have severe speech problems, but no language problems. But as you can see, this box is empty. And then the majority of children are in this yellow box, and they have no or only mild speech problems, but no language problems. And there are two main points that I would like you to get from this figure, which is we do see that all children who have severe speech problems also have language problems. So there are no children who have speech problems but don't have language problems. However, we also see that the children who don't have speech problems or only mild speech problems can still have language problems. And actually, the majority of children who don't have speech problems still have language problems. So concluding, that means that language problems in children with 22q can exist in the absence of speech problems. So therefore, we would recommend language assessment at an early age because we see that this language impairment is already present at an early age. And it can even be present in the absence of speech problems, which are typically more at the foreground maybe at this young age. So I would like to thank my colleagues and of course all the children and parents who participated in our study. And I would be happy to take any questions also via email. You can send us a mail in.
I've received a question in the chat. I'll read it to you. What would be the early age for language assessment? What would be recommended to do at home? So the question, at what stage can you begin as a parent to
I think that really depends on the child. Some children are late with talking, but don't necessarily have a lot of problems, but it's really on the individual child. So I think it's good to just visit a speech and language therapist because they can typically look at the individual child and assess whether language assessment is necessary. But it might be good for parents to point out to speech and language therapists that it's not just the speech problems, but also language problems that they should be concerned about. And you can start that as soon as, I think, 2 or 3 years old, when you would be expecting language production to start up. So if it doesn't happen, it can have multiple causes, both speech problems and language problems.
Hello, just a quick question. I find this very interesting as a study. You have a group together there. Are you looking to continue your research on this group as they grow older?
Is this question aimed at me or at the... Yeah. Yeah, we would love to. Currently, we don't have funding to do that, but hopefully we will be able to acquire funding. All these children are visiting the clinic in Utrecht, so it shouldn't be too difficult to sort of maintain follow-up once there's money. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question on the chat, and I think we still have time for that. It's about a 5-year-old boy who has significant speaking problems and uses his hands to communicate. And the question is, would it be helpful to learn, in addition, sign language?
I find this difficult to answer because I am not a speech and language therapist myself. I think we do see quite a few children in our group who learn additional sign language. But it's really dependent on your child. So the best is to go to a speech and language therapist and to discuss this. And I think they, together with maybe other professionals in school, can make the best assessment of whether this would be helpful. But we have seen children with severe speaking problems who use primarily sign language to communicate. So